Statistiek Suid-Afrika het vroeër die week aangekondig dat die land se amptelike werkloosheidssyfer nou op 34,4% staan. Nou dit is so wat 7,8 miljoen mense wat nie werk het nie. Maar dit sluit nie die mense in wat moedeloos is en opgehou het om aktief werk te soek nie. Tel jy daai getal by, dan staan die werkloosheidssyfer op 44,4%. Nou wat dit nog meer frustrerend maak, is dat kenners al vir jare en 'n half lank waarsku dat toenemende grendelstate en inperkings hierheen sou lei. En hier is ons nou. Tog neek die regering voort met 'n sinnelose ramptoestand, inperkings en grendelstate. Ek is 𝗣ci𝗶𝗶𝘁𝗶𝗏𝗀 en welkom by Polities Inkorrek. En in hierdie episode is my gas, die stigter van Pandemics Data and Analytics, Nick Hudson, en ons gesels oor grendelstate. Nick, welcome to the show.
Hello, Jacques. Thank you very much for having me.
So, it's been a year and a half now of continuous lockdowns. More and more evidence is emerging that lockdowns do not work, that the negative effects far outweigh any type of benefit that was hoped to be achieved. How did we get into this situation, and why are our governments not letting up?
Yeah, that's 100% true. The emergent evidence is, in aggregate, a strong condemnation of the practice of lockdown. But the very surprising thing is that that shouldn't be a surprise to anybody who understands epidemiological modeling. When you've got a disease that has such a profound age-graduated effect, with older people having a mortality rate from infection about 1,000 times that of younger people. You know, for healthy under 70s, this disease presents negligible risk. Mortality rate worldwide for that community is less than 1 in 10,000. And so when you've got a disease like that and you reduce the mobility of all those young, healthy people, what you do is you shift the disease burden onto the vulnerable people and you cause more of them to die. It's the exact opposite of what you should be doing. Of course, this perspective has been suppressed by the relentless censorship that's gone on around any kind of dissent in the face of the ludicrous policies that have been pursued in the wake of the COVID epidemic. But that's the truth. And it hurts the vulnerable in more ways than that strict epidemiological way. You know, in addition to this, what we do is we set up a lockdown that only really wealthy and upper middle class people can comply with. And so you're forcing the disease burden onto poorer people who don't have an option but to carry on, you know, hustling and getting by. And all those so-called essential workers who have to keep doing what they do. And so all the wealthy people hide away behind their Zoom screens and everybody else goes and gets infected on their behalf. And really it should be the other way around. We should be letting the disease transmit amongst the young and healthy people who are going to have a mild cold on average and then become immune in a durable, broad and strong fashion. Instead, they hide away and eventually the disease finds its way to all those old and vulnerable people and many of them die. So there was an expectation up front for anybody with a calm mind and a decent working knowledge of epidemiological models that lockdowns would cause an increase in mortality. And that's indeed what we see in the statistics. But to answer your second question, why did it happen? That's much more difficult. Because as with any complex phenomenon, there are more than one reason for, you know, sitting behind the emergence. But we should observe the following things. Many countries, if not most, had pre-existing pandemic respiratory virus guidelines that had been generated over decades. And without a single exception, those guidelines ruled out the implementation of what they called quarantining of the healthy. They ruled out curfews. They ruled out school closures in all but very extreme conditions, which we haven't even approached. And yet in the space of a couple of weeks in early 2020, all around the world, those guidelines were thrown away and we replaced them with this draconian lockdown policy. Many people say, oh, you know, that's an export of China China was the first country to come up with the idea of lockdown. And then when they went ahead and propagandized it, which they did, they launched a social media marketing campaign that spread around the world very quickly through a swarm of human bots. And they propagandized it, and Italy picked up on the whole story. Everybody else was filled with fear and terror, and they simply copied Italy. And so it went. But there's truth in that narrative. The narrative is true. But the other part that's true is that in the last quarter of 2019, by which time the coronavirus was already in circulation, there was an event organized called Event 201. And at that event, it's really interesting. I mean, it was organized by big tech people. And at that event, they invited members of the CIA, healthcare people from China and the UK and Canada and the US and so on. It was a really massively orchestrated event. And at that event where they're talking about how you would respond to a pandemic, there's no reference made to any of the existing guidelines. They simply propose at that event this kind of draconian approach, which includes lockdown and also the kind of pervasive media narrative control and censorship that we've seen. And we may never find out exactly what conversations happened between these various supranational entities like the World Health Organization and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and the heads of state and public health officials who, on the spur of the moment, it seems, turned from their conventional guidelines to the implementations of these new and draconian policies. Details will emerge over time, but right now that part of the picture remains murky.
There are a lot of strange things that has happened during this pandemic. I mean, a few months after the outbreak in China, the World Health Organization was still quoted by CNN as saying that there's no reason for people to wear surgical masks or KN95 antiviral masks if they're not ill and they don't have symptoms. That's what they stuck to, and that was the general advice that was always accepted to control viruses before that. Overnight, all of a sudden, they changed their opinion. Now you need to wear some kind of covering over your face, even though if it's a buff or a stocking, the legislation just says you need to wear something over your mouth, and now people get fined and get put in prison for it. We've seen the CDC guy, Dr. Fauci in America, constantly giving out conflicting advice. First it was no masks, then definitely masks, then maybe no masks, then 2 masks. Why does it seem that the decision makers are at a loss of what is going on?
Well, they probably aren't at a loss, but what they're not doing is telling you the real reasons for why they're imposing these mask mandates. The official narrative is that there was emerging evidence of the efficacy of masks, but this is completely false. If you look at what evidence emerged between the US CDC, for example, telling the world that cloth masks or masks in general, even surgical masks, didn't work for suppressing a respiratory virus. And a week later, turned around and said, oh, suddenly there's a mask mandate now. If you look at the evidence that emerged in between those 2 points, what you find is there was evidence, but it pointed in the other direction. The CDC published its own study showing that face masks didn't work in influenza, which is a virus with even larger viral particles than coronavirus. So there was emergent evidence, but it spoke against masks. And when you go across to the European CDC, you see exactly the same. They did a meta-analysis, and by their own evaluation, all of the evidence, barring one study, was of low evidentiary value, and the vast majority of the evidence showed signs of bias. So their own meta-study was telling them this is not a good policy recommendation. And once again, the guidelines always said the same. But then then you say, well, why? Why are they doing that? Why do I say that they were not behaving in an incoherent fashion? No, it was very coherent, and we can see it in these releases from these very creepy behavioral science teams that have been seen operative in the UK, South Africa, and Germany in particular, but also in other countries, Ireland and Canada. What we find is that you can see in the minutes of these guys' discussions and in leaks from the discussions that they say, we know that there's no evidence that these things work, but we need to increase the level of fear and perceived level of personal threat. The one guy, Gavin Morgan, a psychologist on the UK's SAGE's behavioral science team, actually broke ranks, and he said he was finding this all very dark. He said, clearly using fear as a means of control is not ethical. He said, but this has given me a very pessimistic view of people, he said. So, their sort of the view was that masks do more harm than good, but the decision to mandate them for healthy people was really a mechanism of psychological control, a way of propagating fear and reminding people of the presence of a deadly virus. And, just even mechanistically, the mask theory doesn't make sense. It's based on a theory of large droplet transmission, which has no supporting evidence. The only supporting evidence for droplets is for aerosol droplets, which pass straight through masks. They're way smaller than a mask would be useful in preventing. So the idea was that it was a complete fabrication, that the disease transmits by large droplets and that the cloth mask would be efficient at screening them. But even though that is true in a very narrow sense, that the large droplets are stopped, what they fail to account for is that after it's stopped, you exhale and the large droplets on the mask are aerosolized. Your mask doesn't get wetter and wetter during the day. It's the water's evaporating because of your exhalation over the droplets, and out go the aerosols. So, that's why we can't see any evidence at all in the aggregate data for the effectiveness of mask mandates. You can look at side-by-side counties where one had a mask mandate and the other one didn't, and they just track each other perfectly. There's absolutely no difference. So it's a completely balked theory that cloth mask mandates work. And as you say, they have implemented it under peril of arrest. They've beaten people up for not wearing masks in certain countries. Germany, Australia, we've seen this kind of stuff. America in certain states. So it's a complete hysteria and just a nonsense, all the way through. And I'm afraid that is true for virtually every element of the response here, all the way up to the situation that we have right now with the proposal for mandatory vaccination, which is completely ridiculous.
You referred earlier on to an event 201 and how various countries already had certain plans in place for respiratory virus outbreaks, etc., which didn't include lockdowns, which actually advised not to implement lockdowns at all. So what were the steps that those pre-planning workshops and whatever came up with to implement in a case such as this?
So are we talking about the workshops that gave rise to the pre-COVID guidelines?
Yes.
Yeah.
What should have been done?
The very interesting thing about the work leading up to pre-coronavirus guidelines is that how measured they were. They always drew attention to assessing the costs and the benefits of measures, and warned that the public health consequences of very draconian measures could be worse than the disease, the cure being worse than the disease. Other things that stand out, depending on which guideline you would read, you would see that they don't even recommend very often quarantining of the sick. They advise people to stay at home when they're ill, They very seldom spoke in favor of such measures as school closures and curfews. That's almost ruled out uniformly under all circumstances. And they drew attention to infection control mechanisms, which is received, and we're talking there in hospital settings. So that's why right at the beginning, in May of last year, Panda's been saying the most important thing you can do is improve ventilation in nursing homes and hospitals. And there's a 100-year history of exactly that as a public health measure, and it's much cheaper than shutting down your economy. We believe that that measure alone would have saved more lives than any other that could have been contemplated. But the other thing you don't do is you don't send sick people into nursing homes. We suggested also, I think it was in about June last year, we suggested that elderly people who are infected with coronavirus should be taken into the houses of young people, because the young people are not really at risk. You know, if they get a little cold, it doesn't matter. And so you get the sick people out of the nursing home so that they can't infect the rest of the old people. But everybody was by then already so terrified. They said, "Oh, you're mad, you will kill all the young people." Yeah, because there was the perception that the disease was dangerous even to children. Yeah, I spoke as late as, I think it was about August last year or September last year. I spoke to a very senior political figure in South Africa who was still advocating school closures. And he didn't even know at that stage, by August and September, that Sweden hadn't lost young people when they kept their schools closed. And that the reason for this is that children were not affected by the virus. And that we'd known this from the very early days in February, when we got the data from the Diamond Princess cruise ship that showed that nobody under the age of 65 on that boat had died. And so you could see very clearly that there was such a strong age graduation to it all. So it's very disturbing that, you know, so much knowledge was thrown out, not just public health knowledge, but also epidemiological knowledge, infection control knowledge. All of this stuff was just thrown away. And these guys, they're basically corrupt scientists, people who are on the payroll of big pharma and vaccine stakeholders. They all just suddenly started preaching this narrative of locking down until we had a vaccine.
So let's talk about Sweden. So for people who haven't followed this in detail, Sweden hasn't locked down at all. They have stayed open for business. I know from friends who live in Sweden that some of the restaurants were quieter and so on because people were, you know, a bit just, hesitant to get the virus. But they, as a government, didn't implement any lockdowns, correct?
That's correct.
And what has the result been? Because people predicted mass deaths in Sweden.
They predicted that, and some of the modelers predicted that they would have, within a matter of weeks, that if they failed to lock down, they would have 90,000 excess deaths. Now, as it turned out, they went through the entire year, not just a few weeks, with anywhere between 0 and 7,000 excess deaths, depending on how you measure it. So without a lockdown, they had, you know, less than 10% of the deaths that had been projected. And so that little experiment alone, that controlled experiment, gave the lie to all of the modeling work that had been done everywhere in the world. And we had the same lunatic stuff going on. The NICD's model initially, actually, I'll talk about their second model first. They overprojected hospital bed utilization by between 13 times and 17 times after we had warned them that the calibration of their model was wrong. And the original model that put us into lockdown, which came out of the University of Stellenbosch's 𝗤𝗶𝗄 unit, had predicted that we would be short by 1 million hospital beds. And that was what terrified everybody. Those initial things that said, look, within a couple of months, we're going to have up to 357,000 deaths, you know. I mean, we're not even close to that now, even with this ridiculous practice of just doing ongoing cumulative measures, you know, where you never reset the clock at the beginning of the year or anything like that. You just keep on counting upwards. Even after nearly 2 years of doing that, we haven't even approached that level. And, you know, they were talking about 357,000 deaths in the first wave, which ultimately killed 21,000 people. And that's with, you know, even after allowing for all of the ridiculous PCR testing that's gone on and over-attribution of deaths to coronavirus. So, you know, they were really way out.
Something I found very bizarre since the beginning of this pandemic, well, at first I just found it interesting, then I started finding it bizarre, was that everyone who was reporting on it was reporting the number of cases. But if you go back and you look at, throughout history, try and look at the Spanish flu, whatever, you don't never see a number of cases, you see a number of deaths suspected to be because of Spanish flu. So the media was reporting cases the whole time. why this emphasis on cases and not actually the damage that the virus is causing? And then after that, I also want to talk about how reliable COVID-19 death counts are.
Yeah, so the emphasis on cases, we believe, is also part of the sort of psychological operation that was going on. We've never before used a simple PCR test or any test at all to determine whether a person represents a case of a disease. Even the name that they give, they say that these are COVID tests. They are not. They are tests for a virus, not a test for a disease. And even then, they're not even really tests for the virus. They're tests for whether your blood contains nucleotides from the RNA of the virus. And that's an important distinction because, you know, a person who's had maybe a very mild case or an asymptomatic infection can continue to have circulating nucleotides in their system for as long as 11 weeks afterwards. And so they've resolved their infection, they've chewed up all the virus, they've got a few proteins swimming around. The PCR tests are ramped up to such an extraordinarily sensitive level that they will trigger positive for those recovered people. And then they will write them down, not just as a case of infection, but as a case of disease, even though they've had no symptoms, maybe didn't even know that they had the disease and haven't even got competent virus in their systems. So everything was tuned to exaggerating and amplifying bad news. And they couldn't do it with deaths because there simply weren't enough deaths to come near to their original projections. So they shifted the attention to cases in a way that was without precedent in medical history. In fact, well, I must correct that. There was one time in the past when this was tried, and the lesson that was learned and that was spoken about by the epidemiologists afterwards was be very careful about setting off a PCR testing epidemic. That was in the case of MERS, another coronavirus. And what had happened there was they were finding the disease all over the place, but it was basically going nowhere. Sorry, they were finding the virus all over the place, not the disease.
There's a lot of questions to be asked about how serious this pandemic is, but we do know that there are people who get very ill, and I personally know people who haven't made it. So the virus is real. That's not what I'm denying. But the way that COVID deaths were counted is also highly suspicious. Can you elaborate on that?
Yes, worldwide that's been a problem, and you can see in developed countries. There's this phenomenon where the number of COVID deaths massively exceeds the measured excess deaths, and they have more sort of accurate systems where they can read that kind of thing very closely. And in fact, in some countries, there were just no excess deaths at all. So it's quite an extreme thing. Several reasons for that. In the United States, for example, there was an incentive paid to hospitals, quite a handsome incentive. I think something like $27,000 or $23,000 per COVID death. And the hospitals, because they were shut down from performing any kind of elective procedures, which is where that's their bread and butter stuff, they were desperate. They were on their knees. And so this incentive was very, very attractive. And so they went as far as they could to misattribute both patients and deaths to coronavirus. And also the standards of reporting a case of the disease were massively weakened. They would say, well, any PCR positive test within 28 days is a case of the disease. And bear in mind, link that to the stat I gave you just now, which is that you could have recovered for 11 weeks and still be testing positive. Now add another 28 days onto that. Anybody in that hospital who had an infection of COVID, maybe even an asymptomatic infection of COVID, within the last 15 or 16 weeks was written down as a COVID case. And sometimes those people were put into COVID wards, even though they weren't at all, infected or infectious. And the person could die of a heart attack or a pancreatitis, nothing to do with COVID, and it would be written down as a COVID death. Now, in South Africa, we have this phenomenon where the 𝗟𝗓𝗎 claims that there's a massively more excess deaths than have been registered as in the official deaths time series. We think it'll be many years before any kind of attribution of those deaths to COVID and non-COVID can be done. It's certainly the case that during the peak periods of panic and the rollout of these draconian measures, deaths from other causes would go up, and also that the measures would worsen death outcomes in general. So we know that, but we think it'll be many years before any kind of precise attribution will be possible. And there is just very weak statistical work being done by Discovery and by the couple of university professors, just pathetically weak stuff, where they're trying to say, oh, it's 90% of the excess deaths or whatever. Yeah, it could be, but to make statements like that with certainty is to be peddling bad science.
Something I've also find very frustrating. So I'm not a doctor. I don't have any kind of medical qualification or degree. That is why I want to hear from as many doctors as possible. I think that's just fair. But we don't see that happening. We see doctors who don't support the official government narrative being censored, being ridiculed in the media. I mean, we even saw the Prime Minister of New Zealand coming out and telling the media that government should be their sole source of information. I mean, where have you ever heard ridiculous stuff like that? Oh, wait, I think Nazi Germany, that sounds familiar. It's just ridiculous, right? So how do we come around this? How do we get around this? How do we get to a place where we can openly talk about these questions without people calling you an anti-vax conspiracy theorist when you bring up real questions regarding the pandemic?
Yeah, or a COVID denier.
Yeah, or a COVID denier, exactly, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I've got such a thick skin now, because whenever I run into somebody who doesn't have an argument, they just resort to name calling. So I'm used to it. I think there are cultural aspects of this. There's been a drift over the years towards censoring people away from free speech and towards cancel culture, So, and I think that is cancel culture and this general construct of postmodernism. They're bedfellows, fellow travelers. And the postmodern construct is that there is no reality. It's all a matter of opinion. It's all subjective. It's about your lived experience. And the argument which wins is simply the argument that's in the hands of the most powerful people, those who are sitting at the crucial part of the relevant hierarchy. And so we don't have to really try and argue relative to reality. It's really just about whether we can silence our opposition and shout louder than them. And those are related concepts, and they have over the years become gradually more and more accepted. And this idea of an ever broadening definition of what constitutes hate speech and what speech should be permitted or not permitted. Those definitions have been creeping for decades now. And so we find ourselves in this really bad situation where a load of pseudoscientific nonsense coming out of some highly conflicted individuals who happen to have the platform in various government committees and councils, that speech is protected, even though they're speaking absolute codswallop. And the speech of dissident doctors, dissident scientists, dissident data analysts is being suppressed, even though nobody has refuted it. So how do we get out of it? I think we have to do a couple of things. What's clear is that there is real danger in having too much centralization in media and social media. We need to get to more distributed platforms that are fundamentally impossible to censor. That I would see it as quite an acute need. If we don't get that right quite soon, we're all in for a totalitarian kind of environment, and it's very hard to get out of that. So there is a need for distributed and decentralized platforms that are not subject to censorship by bad actors. And I also think there's a need for a bit of cultural re-education. We need to remind ourselves of how hard won the battles for individual liberty and free speech were, and how miserable life was for the majority of the inhabitants of the planet before those things became realized. Because we're throwing them away willy-nilly with an expectation that of growth and flourishing and freedom will somehow magically reappear. They won't. They will not. Once you give in to tyranny and totalitarianism, as we are rapidly doing right now, you can find yourself in a very sticky position that can take, as in the case of the Soviet Union, 70 years to get out of.
I think what a lot of people forget is that you might agree with the decisions the tyrants are making today. Doesn't mean you're going to agree with them tomorrow, and you're still going to be under the same tyrant's thumb. Nick Hudson, thank you very much for your time. I appreciate it.
Thanks very much, Jacques. Always a pleasure.
Is COVID-19 'n ernstige virus? Ja, beslis. Ons weet daar's mense wat baie erg siek word, en ons weet daar's mense wat dit ongelukkig nie deur daai siekte maak nie. Maar is dit COVID-19 waar die wêreld die afgelope jaar en 'n half op sy kop gedraai het? Ek sou sê nee. Ek sou sê die virus wat daarvoor verantwoordelik was, is vrees. Vrees wat daartoe gelei het dat regerings ondeurdagte en paniekerige besluite geneem het, wat hulle nie nou kan terugtrek nie, want dit sou beteken hulle sou moes erken dat hulle verkeerd was. Ek is 𝗼𝗶𝗶𝘁𝗶𝗏𝗏 en dankie dat jy polities inkorrek gekyk het. Tot volgende keer.